Hello everybody. In today's video I'm going to be talking about three numbers that seem to always crop up when discussing the latest, greatest, most amazing cars that I really think if you want to choose the best car, you have to ignore. And those are, quite simply, horsepower, 0 to 62 times, and the Nürburgring, or basically any other lap time. Why do I think these three numbers should be ignored? Well, let's talk about that. First off, horsepower. For a very, very long time, that has been the number that we use to work out how powerful a car is and then, by extension, how fast it is. 20 to 30 years ago, when the majority of cars were all naturally aspirated, it was, I suppose, a relatively useful number. Yeah, 400 horsepower supercar would definitely feel quicker than a 200 horsepower hatchback. And that's still true to some extent. But the problem is, horsepower is only one metric of an engine's ability that tells you ultimately very little really. For example, my Honda S2000 is, apparently, 240 horsepower. My Celica GT4 is 250 horsepower, near enough the same. My buddy Steve's Alfa Romeo 4C is 240 horsepower, or it was anyway. All of those cars, however, feel very, very different because those engines will be in different vehicles that weigh a different amount, that have different levels of torque, that have different methods of delivering their power. You might have a supercharged engine, turbocharged, naturally aspirated. You might need to rev the hell out of the thing to get it to produce that power figure. It might arrive at 4,000 RPM. There are so many other things about an engine that excite me a lot more. These days when I'm looking up tech specs of a car and its engine, yes, I of course will look up power and torque because they're very important still, but I'll look up at what RPM they're generated, and then I'm more interested in other things, like for example, the compression ratio of an engine, the aspect ratio, the comparison between bore and stroke that I talk about quite a bit, especially in my current engine series, because I think that tells you a lot about how stressed an engine is or what kind of characteristic it might have. In the olden days, when manufacturers were trying to sell cars, they would often give you a graph of the engine's power and torque. Very, very few will still do that. In fact, the only one I can think of in recent memory is possibly Subaru. I'm sure others do, but those will tell you a lot more about an engine's character and its feel. I'm really not the sort of person that is too worried about whether my car is faster or slower than someone else's, because that kind of pub debate, it doesn't hold any sort of meaning for me. It really genuinely doesn't. And it also doesn't translate to the real world. Case in point, my Honda S2000. Lovely, brilliant, wonderful car. I love it to pieces. But if you are trying to get past somebody, not the easiest thing in the world. It's a very tricky engine to get absolutely spot on and right, and it is quite torque light. However, the 4C, very torquey, very accessible, very easy. If you want to just get around someone, not difficult at all. And those are two cars with the same power figure. Yes, a different weight figure, and in many ways, certainly in terms of a sports car, the weight figure, or maybe power to weight, is perhaps the one that you should be paying more attention to. Next, the 0 to 60 or 0 to 62 time. Well, these should be ignored for one excellent reason. They're very rarely accurate. They're not a useful metric. The only way that I would actually accept a 0 to 60 or 0 to 62 time as being particularly useful is if it were two cars on the same tyres on the same day with the same driver at the same skill level, whatever. If it's an automatic gearbox, you know, just plant it in the same mode with the launch control on or off, whatever. But the simple fact is that manufacturers will fudge their numbers, and they don't always fudge it in the direction you think. They're not always trying to make their cars look quicker than they are. Case in point, Porsche. They deliberately made the old Cayman GT4's numbers slower than everybody knew that it was because they didn't want it to look faster than the 911. That's just corporate politics, marketing strategy, whatever you want to call it. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of reasons manufacturers would do this. You've also got other things, like, for example, when American websites test 0 to 60 times, and no, I say 0 to 60, not 0 to 62, and that can make a difference. You know, one extra gear change between 60 and 62 mile an hour can make a car half a second slower in that metric, but not actually feel any quicker or slower. Many American websites will have this thing they call the 1 feet rollout, that they only start timing the car after it's moved a foot forward. I think it's a drag racing thing. I don't really understand it. Don't know why you would have that as a thing, but it is a thing. And therefore you'll find a lot of numbers. I think it's Road and Track, could be wrong, but I think it's Road and Track will use this 1 foot rollout thing. So you'll look at some of their numbers and they might seem impossibly fast. So that's another problem. You might look at, say, older vehicles, classic cars, older sports cars, older supercars. Well, their numbers will have been generated on the tyres available at the time. And believe it or not, these kind of cars weren't always delivered with ultra sticky track day rubber. Nowadays, you will find a modern hot hatchback which is going to produce the same sort of acceleration numbers as an old school supercar because, well, the old supercar was on tyres that weren't even that sticky 20 years ago, whereas the modern car might be on some sort of weird, crazy rubber that only lasts 2 laps around a track. The other thing is that with the advent of all-wheel drive and dual-clutch transmissions and launch control, 0 to 62 isn't really a great metric for separating cars anymore. Again, like I was saying with horsepower, 25 years ago when they were all naturally aspirated engines, all with manual gearboxes or slow automatics, it was a fairer and more useful comparison. But the fact is that now, a mildly modified hot hatchback can produce the most incredible 0 to 62 numbers. But I've driven lots of these cars. Yeah, they might put amazing numbers down in that first dash, but the real difference in these cars is when you're up to speed. You get, say, a 400 horsepower Golf R at 70 mile an hour and you put your foot down. Then you do the same thing in a McLaren. It's very, very different. I mean, electric cars are perhaps the ones that have really completely annihilated this as a useful metric, because with the way that they deliver their power, they're just putting in insane times. It's great, it's amazing, it's wonderful. And if you're in a nation that really, loves its drag racing culture, then it's maybe a good thing to keep paying attention to. But if you want to know how quick and how powerful a car feels when it's on the road, on the move, really, it should just be ignored. Finally, track times, particularly Nürburgring times. For many of the same reasons as before, you find some numbers which are actually a number of years old. Now, in the case of the ring in particular, parts of the track have been resurfaced, parts of them have been changed. Tyre technology has evolved massively. I have read many, many articles where people have said, oh yeah, well, if we redid this track, this time with the same car, but we just put a fresh set of tyres on it, we'll shave 10, 15 seconds off the time. The Nürburgring also is a 13 and a bit mile track. It's huge. It's massive. I'm sure it's got a lot of benefits for manufacturers and the way that it is, and it's a great thing and people love it, but because it is so long, it will exaggerate, it will accentuate any differences in speed. Case in point, the new 911 GT2 RS, or the relative new GT2 RS, went around the track a few seconds quicker. Was it 7 seconds quicker, 5 seconds quicker, something like that, than the GT3 RS? I haven't looked up the times because, quite frankly, I really don't care. But that was a car that had another 200 horsepower over the GT3. You would think it would be miles faster, especially over such a long track, but it's not, which means in the real world, with a really hot driver, there is no outright speed difference. Like, if you think 13 miles would get me from where I live to the nearest town 6 miles away and back. If I did that journey, and I did that journey in another car, and I wound up doing the journey 5 seconds quicker, I would nearly call that a margin of error. That is so close. If it's 5 seconds over, say, 1 minute 20 lap, something like that, that's a huge difference. That's a really big, huge difference as far as lap times are concerned. And if you were in a race situation, 5-6 seconds over that 13-mile Nürburgring lap is certainly a huge advantage. But we're generally not talking about race cars. We are talking about road cars. And when manufacturers are setting these laps, they have, broadly speaking, everything. They have the best cars, they have the factory engineers, they have the best drivers in the world, they have as many tyres as they like, as much time as they like. If it's a manufacturer that's really serious about this. Now, there were a lot of accusations back in the day, particularly concerning Porsche and Nissan's kind of tit for tat with the 911 and the GTR, about how legitimate some of these times were, but these days I think all the times are pretty straight. And Lamborghini in particular set some crazy times around that track. But they're times set under the best, most perfect conditions, that unless you are that race driver with thousands or tens of thousands of laps of experience at that track, and essentially no fear, it would seem, and unlimited resources, yeah, maybe you'll be able to get close to that time. But for everybody else, for all of us mortals, I mean, again, it's the kind of, how much do you value being able to brag to your mates down the pub? Because these days, I don't really, invest that much in that sort of thing. I care much more about the way a car makes me feel, the way it handles, the way it steers, the way you can interact with it, the way it sounds. I would happily take, say, okay, let's just say something like a McLaren. I would happily swap 40 horsepower out of one of those to make them sound a lot better, as I'm sure actually many owners would. It's as simple as that. There are other things that mean more to me. I live on the roads. A lot of people keep saying that, with a speed limit of 70 mile an hour and traffic and this and the other, what is the point of supercars, these sorts of things? Well, there is a lot of reasons to own these sorts of cars. It isn't always about the speed. To me, it's about many other things first before you get to the speed. But in terms of measuring whether the car is actually better than another one, all of these things, the horsepower, the 0 to 62 times, the Nürburgring lap times, they mean so very little. I recall seeing, I think it was a Top Gear, and they had the 720, McLaren 720, I'm sure it was, and they wanted to see how quick it was versus the P1. Could have been the 675 LT. Again, point is, it doesn't matter. But they were told that they had to do the lap at a certain time of day, because they were like, if you've got to do it in this half-hour window if you want to achieve the correct lap time. These are the details. This is the extent that these people go to get these times out of these vehicles. I just don't care. I just really don't care. And I think not caring, giving up the caring about all of these things has improved my relationship with cars so very much, because it means I now look at the things that are important to me, and it's allowed me to make some much better decisions when it comes to buying cars. So there you go. There's a little rant from me on something I think is quite interesting. Hope you've enjoyed it. Bye-bye.